Okay, so good morning, everyone. It's been a while since I know I've been up here, but it seemed like with the fact that Joel was going to be gone for quite a few weeks, and the fact that we just finished Colossians, that it just sort of worked out for me to be able to come up here and share some stuff with you guys that I've been thinking about for a while. That before we start the book of James, which is actually where we're going next, which we'll do after Joel comes back, I figured that, just this time just sort of seemed to work out well enough for, me to be able to share some of the, sort of random things that go through my brain a lot of times. It's one of those things where I've spent a lot of time thinking not just about stuff in general, but even specifically about what it is that God is truly wanting us to be doing. It's sort of related to what I actually spoke about a couple weeks ago during communion about the fact that we need to have our focus on what we should be doing rather than just on what we shouldn't, on not doing what we shouldn't be doing. And so I've struggled to sort of figure out what exactly that looks like. Throughout my life, there's always been those certain things that people talk about and seem to overemphasize with stuff that to be a Christian is basically just it's not having sex, or at least not before marriage, not doing drugs or saying bad words or doing all of these other little things that I'm not going to say we should do or anything like that, but I've just never been totally sold on that exactly being the point of how all of this looks. Or there's other times where it seems like what people are saying is that almost every single word out of your mouth should be something about Jesus, and you should somehow be using that to share with every other person and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, I do understand some of that, but yet at the same time it can become very hard for me, at least, as well as other people who just don't even talk that much or have trouble, even having conversations with people. And so it's been somewhat hard to see what all of this is truly supposed to look like. And so, again, I've spent a whole lot of time going over this and a lot of time through looking at what the Bible actually says about all this stuff, that you often hear people talk about how the Bible has the answer to everything, but yet it's sometimes a lot more obscure than we tend to think it is, that sometimes the answers aren't quite as obvious and out in front as a lot of people think they are. One of the places we can see this is specifically within the law, or the first 5 books of the Bible, that sometimes it can seem like it's very hard to understand what's going on there, and people have a tendency to either overemphasize or underemphasize it, where either they just throw it out and to where it has no meaning at all anymore, because we're under the new covenant, so there's no purpose for it. Or other people basically say that you have to follow every little thing about it or else you're going to end up in hell. And so, and then there's even the other people who are somewhere in between that who basically pick and choose which parts to follow and which ones you don't want to follow. Oftentimes they have reasonings for it, thinking that it's obvious to tell which parts are moral, which parts are cultural, or whatever else. But the reality is it's not quite as simple as people have often made it out to be. It's not quite as clear how all of that is actually supposed to work together. But yet, we do have to recognize that there is an importance to the law. If you actually think about it, you can look and see that the rest of the Old Testament is very much based upon the law. And if you don't understand it, you don't understand what they're talking about. You can see it specifically in the prophets where they're continually pointing people back to the law, just telling them to do what God said, and then he wouldn't be so upset with them and bringing judgment against them because they were doing the exact opposite of it. And with the reality that the New Testament itself, you can't understand that without the Old Testament. We recognize you also can't understand the New Testament without understanding the law. But when we take this even further, we can see that within the law itself, the same idea sort of comes about, that Genesis is the basis for the rest of the law. And even within Genesis, we can see how chapters 12 through 15 are dependent upon 1 through 11. And 4 through 11 get dependent upon 1 through 3. And even chapter 3 itself, you can't understand without understanding the first 2 chapters. And it goes all the way back to the point that you can't understand even that without understanding the very first verse, which we know says that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And we see the law as being so important because that is the very foundation for everything. That without that reality, you can basically just throw the rest of the Bible away because it has no meaning anymore. But since we know that God is the creator of everything, it gives meaning to everything else that we have within it. And it helps us be able to see and understand what all of it is about, even when things begin to get a little cluttered and hard to understand exactly what is going on there. That can be one of the things that we can help us to understand the rest of it. But we also find in the Gospels that Jesus gives something else for us to be able to help understand this. When he is asked what the greatest commandment is, he says, "You shall love the Lord your God in your whole heart and in your whole soul and in your whole thinking. This is the greater and first commandment. And a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And these two commandments, the whole law is being hung, also the prophets." That Jesus makes it clear that if we want to understand the law and the prophets and what is being said there, that we have to understand what it means to love God and what it means to love our neighbors ourselves. That the entirety of those things are being based upon, or as it says, they're being hung upon it. It's almost as if it's using the imagery of, a little coat rack or whatever with those pegs, that the law and the prophets are like a jacket that you hang upon those things, and it just sort of falls and has no meaning or purpose without the understanding of those two things. And so this can give us a picture of what all of this is supposed to look like, and even some of those places in the Bible that can get confusing to us. And there's another passage here that also helps us begin to understand this. In Romans, it says, "Therefore, I appeal to you, brothers, through the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a holy, living, well-pleasing sacrifice to God, your logical, worshipful service. And do not keep being molded to this age, but keep being transformed by the renewal of your mind into the thing for you to test what is the will of God, the good and well-pleasing and complete one." That we get this picture of something that we find within the law where it speaks a lot about sacrifices and what those are supposed to look like. It describes in Leviticus and Numbers and even in other places within it how they were supposed to be doing these sacrifices. And now Paul tells us that we're supposed to be living sacrifices ourselves. So to understand that, we have to have somewhat of an understanding of what the law is all about in the first place. And all of this ultimately leads up to what the entirety of this series of sermons that I'm going to be preached for the next 3 weeks of sacrifices of love. That if we're going to truly be doing what God has called us to do, it's going to look like this. It's going to look like us actually sacrificing ourselves through the idea of love and what it's all about. And really, ultimately, the sort of the basis for where that comes, and sort of the idea of why I put the fire as the background to this, is that we're offering ourselves, which means that we're going to actually be burnt up in this process. And it sort of becomes the idea of getting over ourselves and letting go of everything that we have. I'll talk more about what that looks like and means next week, but we have to understand that as sort of the background to what all of this is, because that's what a sacrifice truly is. And we're going to be beginning this with my sermon entitled, "Lawve Your Neighbor." And I think it's one of the best ones I've ever come up with, but it's the whole idea that it sounds like you actually are saying love, even if sort of in a weird way, but it combines the idea of law and love having to do with one another, which leads us right into that passage that I gave you and the very end of it, where it says that in these two commandments, the whole law is being hung, and also the prophets. It's this idea that there's a connection between the law and the prophets and these two commandments here. And what it boils down to is that there are two ways that we can understand this. The first one is that you cannot do the law without love. we find this throughout the Gospels, that Jesus continually confronts the religious leaders and others about this reality that they've missed it, because even when they've done the law, they haven't been doing it out of love at all. One of the examples you can find in Matthew 15 and also Mark 7, where Jesus gets on the people because they were teaching their own ideas and traditions as if they were commandments from God. They had one where if they claimed that something was given to God, they could technically still use it for themselves, but it couldn't use it to benefit anyone else in any way. And so it was basically a way of specifically, you defined it as them getting around the commandment of loving their mother and father, because they didn't have to use it to help them out any, even though it could still actually benefit them. It just couldn't benefit anyone else. And Jesus goes on in that thing to say that, and many other things you do like this. So it wasn't that this was just one little thing that they had messed up. This was a common idea of the way that they were doing stuff. It was all about benefiting themselves, and so they basically didn't have to love their neighbor at all. You can see through the rest of the Gospels the idea that what they actually loved was the law, the temple, and every other thing that God had given them, except for God himself, that they had missed actually loving him because they were loving all of these other things instead of loving him. Another example we have is with the rich young ruler, that he comes to Jesus asking him what he needs to do to have eternal life. And so Jesus starts off by listing off some of the 10 Commandments, and he said that he had done those things since birth. But Jesus said that there was one thing that he was still lacking, that he needed to go, sell everything he had, and give it to the poor. And he was unable to do that because it made it very clear that he loved his money more than anything else. He didn't love the people enough to share or help them, even if it didn't mean giving away all of his wealth. And he didn't love God because he loved money way more than he ever loved God. So it sort of helps us show that even keeping the commandments themselves didn't actually constitute love. But yet, there was still this point behind it that without the love, it was just doing things rather than, actually doing the whole purpose of what the law was all about. And this sort of leads to the other way that you can understand this, the idea that you can't understand what love is without the law. That you actually, that's it gives you sort of a definition of what love actually looks like when you understand what love is. I'll give you the example of taking some of the 10 Commandments, 6 through 9. It says, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, and do not bear false witness. There's a lot of connection within these four, that really the reality is that adultery is a form of stealing, specifically to their understanding of what adultery actually looked like. And we see that actually false witnessing is really the same thing as murder when you start to think about it. For starters, most of a lot of their laws would require the death penalty. They didn't really have prisons or jails like we do, so if you were accusing someone of something, it could literally end in their death. And if you were falsely accusing them, it really would be you actually being the one murdering them. Or even if it wasn't something that actually led to their death, you could still call it what it could be considered, something social murder, that you were destroying their lives socially, which would impact everything else going on with them. Even at the time of Jesus, this was something that could even lead to a person's death through starvation specifically, because they would be unable to do business with anyone else. And so it would lead to them, because of their reputation and everything else. And we know, that once a person's reputation is ruined, it's very hard for them to get it back, even when it's very clear that they didn't do the thing that people had been accusing them of. And so we can see how all of these different things very clearly are not loving to the people to whom we're doing them. To the people around us, it's clearly not loving to them. But as I began to actually think about this and try to understand and consider how I can take this and understand it, what I talked about earlier about what we're supposed to do with it rather than just what we're not supposed to be doing, I began to see how they all sort of connect in with one another, that it has to do with respecting a person. has to do with respecting them and their livelihood and all the aspects of that. And what I mean by that is that you can take, for example, the false witnessing, and I talked about it being social murder. It's respecting their social livelihood. Or with stealing, it's respecting their possession livelihood, or whatever you want to call it. With the not committing adultery, it's respecting the sexual, intimate, emotional, however you want to see that part of their livelihood. And obviously murder would be part of respecting their physical livelihood. And so what it means to actually do these things, or to not be doing these things, but what it looks like, in the doing sense of it, would be to be respecting the person's whole livelihood, all of the aspects of it, everything that they are. And that this is part of what it really looks like to actually love someone, is when we begin to see this. And really what it boils down to is when we really want to define what love is in sort of a little short thing, it's doing what is best for another person. And we can begin to see this, but the hard part is that sometimes we think we know what this looks like, because we tend to think it's just doing whatever makes a person happy, or they're going to like whatever's coming to them, but it doesn't always actually look that way. And again, the law can sort of help and guide us and show us some of that stuff. And this is really goes down to the point of one of the things that I learned through all of this is how to understand the law best, is that it's a guide for how we're supposed to be getting through life. It helps guide us in the directions that we're supposed to be going, that it wasn't necessarily meant to just, give rules and do all of these other things, but it was meant to sort of show us and guide us in what love actually looked like. If you go through the law, you actually see there's a lot of things that could be called, that aren't just commandments, but they could be called case law or case studies. They give examples of things that could happen and what you're supposed to do in situations like that. I don't know if this is an actual one, but it's probably similar to one. But, something like if there was a broken fence between you and your neighbors and you were supposed to fix it because you'd broken it and you didn't, and some of their animals got out and got killed, you would be responsible for that, and you should repay for that animal as well as even more, a little bit more than that. And so it sort of helped show us what love actually looks like. If you actually love your neighbor, you're going to help them in cases where you did something that damaged them in one way or another, even if it wasn't intentional. And so you help them out in that process. So it sort of helps guide us into what some of that stuff looks like, even if it's not always specifics, because we see a lot of the situations we face in life are not going to be defined so easily like what those things are, but we can take and see how it does define some of those things and use the situations we do come into to see how it might look in something like that. And so this is why I describe it like this, that the law is a guide to help us see the general idea of it. In reality, the law is supposed to help us see what love actually looks like, in the sense so we don't need it any longer. What I mean by this is actually described in the book of Colossians. Paul says, "Therefore let no one keep judging you in eating and in drinking, or in participation of a feast, festival, or a new moon, or Sabbaths, which things are a shadow of the things being about to come, and the body is of the Anointed One." It's this whole idea that it took me forever to realize this, because most translations translate that as substance or something else. But when you begin to see that it actually means the word body, you can begin to understand that if you look and you see a shadow, it gives you a picture of what's making that shadow actually looks like. It gives you, it doesn't give you a perfect image of it, but it gives you an outline, a general form of what it looks like, and it points you to that thing that's actually making the shadow. That was what the law was supposed to be the entire time. It was this shadow that was pointing them to the Anointed One, to Jesus and who he was. And, we can easily call him the exact embodiment of love anyways, so we can see how the law points us right to the one who shows us what perfect love actually looks like. So the law is simply a guide to get us there, and then once we see the reality behind it, then we can just start actually doing it. Because what this comes down to is the law points us to this idea that love means doing what is best for a person. It helps us see and describe what it looks like, but it's not going to go and give us every little detail of exactly how we go about doing that. And so that's why we have to not just look to it, but look to the reality behind it that point us even further onto what we're supposed to be doing. And so as we get these takeaways of what this looks like, we see that to begin to actually love your neighbor, you have to understand love. And to understand love, you have to understand that it's based upon the law, and it begins to describe and define for us what this looks like. Again, you can actually go even further to the fact that the whole entire Bible itself gives us a picture of what love and what all of this actually looks like. It gives us this guide for how we're supposed to be going about doing it. And so, but it begins with us actually understanding what all of this stuff looks like. And so this is, again, obviously the very first point that we have to take from this. But there's another point that we have to understand in this, is that if we're going to love people and understand what that looks like, we also have to know our neighbor. That if you don't do that, you can't actually love them very well. On the one hand, this may be sort of obvious to people, but on the other hand, it may be something that sometimes we tend to overlook and don't think about. But there's a major importance to this because, again, you can't know the right way to go about treating a person unless you actually know how they respond to things. Something that I sort of thought about and realized years ago through this other passage that's similar. It says, therefore, all things, as much as if you might want, in order that men might do to or for you, thus also you yourselves be doing to them, for this is the law and the prophets. You know, it's the whole thing of do unto others that you'd have them do to you. That's the easier way of saying it. But it's the point that a lot of times we take this too literally and miss what it's actually saying. That if you just do the literal thing you want someone to be doing to you in a certain situation, it's not necessarily going to work out in the same way that it would work on you. We see that people don't respond to everything in the same way. It's more of the idea of getting, in some sense, you call it the same results from that person as you'd want in their situation, but it might be done in a different way. I'll give you what's probably a bad example, but it's the only thing I could really come up with. But the thing is if a lot of times when a person, what needs to be happening for them is to be comforted, people think that hugs are a good way to go about doing it. And for some people, obviously, that does work. But there are other people out there who you're just not going to help them with. That if someone, particularly a random stranger, comes up and tries to do it to me, it's going to make me way more uncomfortable than do anything to actually comfort me. And so we can see that a lot of times the exact thing that we might want someone to do for us might not be the thing that's actually loving or helpful for them in that situation. But we recognize we're still trying to get that same thing of comforting them in some way, but you don't know what that looks like until you actually know them well enough to know how they respond to things. And so this is such an important thing for us to get, is that we really have to understand and know our neighbor if we're going to really be doing this. And it can lead us to situations where, again, we understand that love means doing what's best for a person, and we recognize that it doesn't always mean bringing about happiness. And when someone has has an issue struggling with wanting stuff and always having stuff and greed or something like that, the best thing for them might not be to get a gift to them, even if you think that might be loving or whatever. But yet, they have so much and they just want more, and it's not necessarily going to be helpful to them. Maybe you do get them something that they don't want, but they actually do need, that they're overlooking. There are situations where you can get around that, but you're recognizing that what's best for them isn't just feeding into the thing they're struggling with, but it's doing something to actually help them out of it, even though it's probably not going to make them necessarily very happy with you. But we have to recognize and see that this is through how we know our neighbor and how we understand the law, even things that are more of a struggle to understand, and then we go out and actually be doing this. And when it comes to knowing your neighbor, this is sort of one of those things where we recognize that this is first done within the Christian community itself, that it has to be done there First, not just because the New Testament really first commands us to love one another within the church before we go love others outside, that really it's just supposed to be a thing that just sort of spreads out because of loving one another. But we also see that we're the ones who are supposed to know each other that well anyways, that we should be able to do this in some sense more easily because we're supposed to be united and that close with one another. And so it should become more easy for us to do it in that kind of a situation. And then the final part of this is that you just have to go and you actually have to do it. That, again, it's not just knowing and understanding these things, but you actually have to go out and do it, or else it doesn't accomplish you anything. Jesus made this very clear when he spoke to the people, that just hearing his words didn't benefit them, but they actually had to go out and do them as well. And so we have to be doing this very same thing. But we also have to recognize that when starting out on this, that we do have to go back and start with the other things. That maybe the first thing you need is to actually understand the law, or to understand the Bible and what it's telling you and talking about. And that might be where you actually have to start with all of this. Or maybe you have a pretty decent understanding of that, and where you actually need to start with is getting to know your neighbor better and different kinds of fellowship and whatever else that might look like. These are some of the spots that we actually have to start before we can fully do it, but we actually have to start taking some kind of action. Or if we really think about it, the reality is that what we all need is both of these things. So maybe we should just start combining them together to do something about this. That if we really want to start loving our neighbor, then we need to start with both fellowship and having a better understanding of what God is calling us to. And maybe what we need to do is to actually take the time to actually get to know one another and see people outside of this place. That's honestly one of the things that I've been trying to push and get people to understand over the whole time that I've been out here, is that that's really what God is calling us to in the first place. It's not about really anything we do here. That if we stop doing this, it wouldn't negatively benefit us if we were doing the rest of it the way that we were supposed to be doing. And maybe the very thing that we need to do to actually start loving our neighbor is to go and find ourselves into little groups where we're meeting throughout the week, where we're discussing what God is calling us to do and getting to know each other, and then even practicing these things in different ways, where I'm not talking about some kind of formal Bible study or anything. I'm not telling you that you need to come to the Sunday school or the Tuesday Bible study or anything else we're doing. All I'm saying is that what you could easily do is just get people together at some specific time, to start with. Have all of you be reading from the Bible, whether you're reading the same thing or different things, and come and just discuss what you've been reading. And then go and continue to do that at some kind of a pace. Again, this doesn't have to be something you do weekly. You can have multiple of these groups going on with different people. You can not necessarily meet at the same time every week, not have anything planned until you leave from the meeting that you have for the next time. But again, I'm not talking about formal stuff that we're doing. I'm just talking about general stuff. That sometimes we get caught up with this idea that if we're not doing something churchy or church-like with people, we're not actually accomplishing anything. But yet we have to recognize that we need that fellowship with one another just as much as we need the rest of it. But yet we can also go and combine these things into some way where we are getting a benefit and still doing some kind of a talk about who God is and what He's calling us to as we get to know one another. So my challenge is for you guys, specifically the ones who are better at organizing things and talking to people and whatnot, to go to some of the ones who aren't and start trying to get some of this started, just asking them if they'd be wanting to do this with you. Meet with you guys at some point or whatever it is in groups of, maybe 4 to 8, and just be doing stuff together and reading the Bible and then talking about it with one another and figuring out exactly how you want to make this work. But get something started and see where it goes from there, and see how you can begin to truly know what it is to love your neighbor and actually begin to do it. So that's the very first part of what it actually looks like to be doing sacrifices of love, is to be understanding your neighbor and how our sacrifices are actually supposed to be benefiting the ones around us.